I finished university in the early 80s, and quite honestly, there wasn't really a documentary scene at that time. There were a few people making films, but there wasn't really there were no documentary festivals, there was not too many opportunity to see documentaries. So maybe it was possible to be interested in documentary, but for that you had to either travel abroad, or because remember, early 80s, we don't have DVDs, we don't have the internet, we don't have VHS, so it was very, very limited. And I mean, even the Film Society movement, for example, both in Delhi and I'm sure it was like that in Kerala also, was not really, did not have any interest in the documentary film. So I myself, I think I wanted to be a journalist, and it just so happened that in the early 80s, the journalism scene in Delhi was so dull and so uninteresting, and some of my seniors had gone into it and they were having such a hard time that I got an opportunity to research on a documentary film, and somehow that experience of researching and then going on a shoot on a film for several months, it suddenly, I found in the documentary a very, very interesting place for myself, because I was somebody, I'm interested in scholarship, in research, but that's not what I want to do. I'm interested in the world around me, but not necessarily like a journalist is. So I think the documentary film at that time, I thought, this is great, this is a space in which both these interests can find some kind of articulation. But as I said, there wasn't really a documentary scene. So how do you decide I'm going to be a documentary filmmaker when there is nothing happening around you? But as always happens, series of accidents. I was supposed to assist somebody on a film, and then he couldn't work on the film because he had to make a feature film, and so I got to co-direct it and so on. So as accidents. So what happened eventually is that I was quite young. I must have been 24 or 25 when I got to direct my first film. And even at that time, I don't think it was a serious thing, because like I said, unless you feel you're part of a community, it's not possible to identify yourself as a practitioner, and it's only by the mid to late 80s that in Delhi, I started meeting other people who, like myself, were making their way into documentary film. And these are many people with whom I worked with later, they are filmmakers and technicians. So Ranjan Palit, who's a cinematographer and a filmmaker, Reena Mohan, who's an editor and a filmmaker, and Samira Jain, who's a filmmaker and an editor. So all of us were sort of, I suppose, making our way towards documentary filmmaking. So I think it's only somewhere in the late 80s that I could tell myself, okay, so this is who I am, I'm a documentary filmmaker. Until then, it really wasn't possible in India, certainly. I have for quite a long time maintained that in many ways, the emergency, 1975 to 1977, is a very crucial trigger in the history of the Indian documentary. As you know, several people, including Anand Patwardhan, made their first films during this period. Anand made Prisoners of Conscience. But it also led to what we today know as the civil liberties movement, and I think that overlap, that the documentary film begins to get reimagine itself from there was a past, of course there was a past, the Films Division films and so many others. But in that phase, documentary film was really seen as as part of propaganda. It could be for the state, it could be for a private company, whatever. But I think the emergency created that rupture, and in that rupture, documentary films also came, the civil liberties movement also came, and there was a relationship between the two. And why that is important is because that connection with the world of activism whether it's in the field of human rights, whether it's in the field of environment, meant that it also brought an audience in. So it wasn't simply the documentary filmmakers were working in collaboration with human rights activists or environmental activists, but that once the films were made, many of those people actually created the audiences for these films. So I think that, to my mind, what started then is what is most interesting about Indian documentary. The fact that Indian documentary filmmakers, by and large, have had a very interesting relationship with the audience. And the work, it's not as if it's made with that, for that audience in a sense. But all of us know that when we finish a film, there's an audience waiting for it, you know. And I think that's a very reassuring thing. It did come out of a certain activist mode. So who were the people who were initially showing films? There were trade unions, there were activist groups, there were political groups, there were NGOs, that world, you know. But over a period of time, it has obviously expanded. So the sort of alternative film festival circuit. But again, even if you look at the interesting alternative film screening circuits, all of them have come out of activism. And here, if I think of, say, Amudan in Madurai runs a Madurai Film Festival. In the Hindi-speaking belt, we have the Pratirodh cinema, the cinema of resistance circuit. Again, it comes out of a kind of progressive politics. In Calcutta, you have People's Film Collective and the festival they run. So that is a continuing relationship. It's just that the difference is that now many of those, let's say, activist spaces, they don't restrict themselves only to the so-called activist film. They will show all kinds of film. So let's say the description of what is considered political has expanded. So maybe in the 70s or early 80s, not very many films were being made about, say, gender or sexuality. Today they are. And those bring their own audiences into that space. So I think that if you were to use the word such as the new documentary, I think I would date the new documentary to post 1977 and the end of the emergency. Very often, people, I think we declare, oh, this kind of filmmaking is dead, no one's watching it, or now everybody is only watching that. I mean, these are all, I think, overstatements. Sometimes even when you see something as being hailed as new, if you only know your own cinema history, you'll say, but this is not new, this has been done 30 years ago, even if it's a film with very short cuts, or, people have been doing that earlier also, there's a history. So I think some of it comes from an ignorance about the history of cinema, but I want to actually argue that many of us who've been making films, I mean, it's when digital technology arrived, let's say by the 90s, we had access to it, mid to late 90s. Actually, digital technology and this new audience actually allowed many of us to make those longer films. So I don't think I had made a long film before I shot my first film on digital video, which was a film I made in the Narmada Valley, Words on Water, It was an hour and a half long. Until then, the sheer expense of it wouldn't have allowed it. Now, I do understand that there is this preoccupation with attention span, Television broadcasters have it internationally, everybody has it. But I believe that an attention span is something that you signal to your audience also. If you tell me I'm going to show you a 2-minute film about something that happened in Kashmir, then I'm expecting to get my information in a certain way. But if I begin to show you a long film, I think it's an hour and a half long, let's say. From the first frame, somehow I signal to you that, look, this is different. Pay attention, you know. And I'm going to tell you a story in a different way. I don't sense audience attention being a problem. I'll tell you this. I made my film in Kashmir, Jashn-e-Azadi. It's a 2 hour and 19-minute film. And when we were preparing it at the last stage, at that time, just simply to accommodate it on one DVD was difficult. So we decided to put an interval in it so that it could be put in 2 DVDs. What is interesting is that since that interval was there, even when we screened the film, there was an interval, right? And for me, it was always a test that it's a very long film. Most people who come to watch it are not sure how long it is. They might think it's an hour long. And then they discover it's more than 2 hours long. Then you put an interval. People will get up. Will they come back? Because there's nothing to hold them back. And it was like a test for me, and for my editor. And eventually, I've done many screenings of that film where I've been present myself, maybe 150. It's very, very rarely that the entire audience doesn't come back, So what does that mean? That film particularly, it's not as if it has some gripping story or it has some narrative or, no. But the form of it is such that the audience is willing to give you that space. So I don't think attention span by itself is a problem. I think that I'm not saying that every 2 hour film is going to be gripping, but I do believe that if the audience, look, we come from a culture where we are used to very long storytelling, so that's not new. Do people have the time? Maybe in an educational institution, I know it's a problem. People will say, we wish we could show your film, but we don't have 3 hours in a college day or a school day. But by itself, I have never conceded, this attention span as a problem. I think that a well-crafted film can be 4 hours long, it can be 6 hours long. Yes, you do lose some audience. A shorter film has more of an audience. But I think it's also important that sometimes there are certain stories, there are certain complexities, there are certain ambiguities that you can't reach very quickly. If I'm trying to tell you a complicated story about Kashmir, I can't tell it to you in 15 minutes. I need the time in which your mind travels over that terrain again and again and again, so that then when I move to the next base, I can, you already, something in your head the space has been created. So it's a risky business because yes, you can lose audiences, but on the whole, I see many more long films being made, and quite honestly, I think that what I get from long films, I rarely get from short ones, because sometimes a long film, even if it's not very well made, because there's a richness of material and that time span, I can literally reconstruct it and make my own film in my head, and understand something about what I have seen. I think one of the things that one always tries to tell audiences is that documentary is not reality, It's a perception, it's a telling of a reality. And therefore, there is an authorial kind of intention, there is a authorial control. Nothing that you see in the film is by accident, every sound, every cut, very often people will watch a film and say, was that song, did you place that song there by accident? And you say, well, it can't be, there's nothing in a film, so it's all deliberate, right? But I think I'll certainly agree that in recent years, as filmmakers, I think we are concerned with finding a language for documentary storytelling. You know, I'm here in Trivandrum and watching films at the festival, and I have seen several films where you find somebody has taken a very simple story but found a language which is uniquely available to the documentary. You know, in a fiction film, you can't do that. You know, at the same time, it's not simply that they went to a place and planted a camera and recorded it. No, they've constructed something, they've framed something, they've edited something, they've given it a pace, they've put sound effects, whatever it is. So I think that to me, that is the most exciting thing about the documentary form, that we are ideally constantly playing with form. You know, some of my recent work has been in the form of what one would call a kind of essay film, but there are others who do very, very detailed observational portraits of individuals, of characters, of families. Somebody else might do it in a more as a musical. So, in a sense, what is so fantastic about the documentary is that there is no fixed form for it. Even people are using fiction within documentary. So ultimately, I don't know what the difference anymore is. Like I've been saying, I see enough feature films, fiction films, which use the tricks of the documentary, and then I see enough documentaries that use those methods of the fiction film. So there isn't really that, those borders are not sharp anymore. What it does is that it leaves. I mean, I have a friend who makes films in Canada, Ali Kazmi, and he's made a long, I think it's more than an hour-long film on the Kamagata Maru, the ship which brought revolutionaries from Canada to India and then back again. And it's made entirely from, or 80% of it is made from maybe 10 still photographs, which have been animated in very, very interesting ways. Who would imagine that you can make a full-length, feature-length documentary out of 10 still photographs? But obviously you can. So I think sometimes people do films which are very, very strongly shaped by soundtracks. People are using animation. So yes, new and engaging modes of storytelling must be deployed. But the one thing so if you were to ask me, so what distinguishes the documentary film? To me, the answer lies in that, to me, the documentary is not selling the audience. It's not just trying to reach an audience, it's also trying to say something. I think that the commercial film, the feature film, because it involves so much money, large budgets, its primary force behind it is money has been invested, money must be recovered, and that shapes everything. Now, there are people who do very interesting experimental work within that, but I'm just saying, by and large. In the documentary, of course, people put in money, they need to recover money in whatever it's not different. But I think that's not the primary intention. That I think that we are storytellers, but we don't simply want to tell a story. I think that the documentary is an argument. I want to make an argument to you, whether it's about the large dams in the Narmada Valley, or it's about what's happening in Kashmir, or what's happening in Bastar. I want to make an argument for you, but I'll find a form through which you can access that argument in a more engaging way. It's just the same way that when you sit down to write something, you don't just put down your ideas in 15 points. You work hard to make it attractive and to draw you in. So that's very important for us. Documentary film and documentary filmmakers are part of the larger universe So whatever are the market forces, the social forces around you, you are also shaped by it, um, even by technological forces like we talked about. That if digital technology had not come in the ways that it had, perhaps there would not have been such a sort of efflorescence of filmmaking. Similarly, the internet is an extremely powerful new influence. So, not just in terms of distributing images or for us to see things, but also the fluidity it gives potential filmmakers in terms of today, anybody who's interested in film, you hardly mention a film to them and they'll Google it and they'll be watching it in the next few hours. So it does shape, the visual imagination is changed by all this. However, um, I'm very heartened by the fact that even if we take the last 30-35 years, I've been watching films and being part of the documentary film scene. It's very interesting that today a film like Anand Patwardhan's Reason will still draw full houses, even though the mode that he's using is a very old-fashioned one by my many reckonings. And I think that's very interesting. Now, which is not to say that that's the only form of storytelling that's going on. Like I find very interesting experiments in the last year in the run-up to the recent elections that we had here. A lot of people were making small videos, putting them up. I think that who can argue that those videos, which were probably shot in, couple of hours and uploaded in a couple of hours with some titles, that they are not as effective as a documentary that took 2 years to make. Sometimes it's possible. It's just a question of were you at the right place at the right time. So I think that flexibility is very important, and I don't believe in hierarchies. In that, for example, it's not as if in the old days there would be people who would say, "Oh, but you can only make a film when you're shooting on celluloid, and video is nothing," and that kind of hierarchy of technology, of modes of exposition. I think there's no such thing. I think that ultimately, if you're a political person, then you will deploy whatever you can in the most effective ways that is possible to you. If I want to tell people in India, I want to raise a discussion around Kashmir, well, I chose to do it through a long essay film. On the surface of it, it may not have seemed the most effective way of doing it. But now, 12 or 13 years after I made the film, I feel that I did the right thing, because the kinds of conversations that kind of essay film generated are actually what I think needed to be started. They had to be deeper conversations. They didn't have to have all the answers in it immediately, that Kashmir is X or Kashmir is Y, but that what is Kashmir? What does it mean for Kashmiris? What does it mean for Indians? So I think that I was actually, like, one of the things I'm concerned about is that in the last 15-20 years, we've built a documentary screening culture. Is it going to survive? And how is it going to survive when people are now watching films on their phones, they're watching on iPads? What is it about a screening culture which is important? Because now it's not simply that, oh, I want to see your film, so I'll go somewhere to see it. Now it's that I can see your film on my phone, but is there going to be a conversation when I go to see that film which will make it worth my while? I know that in Delhi, for example, when we have screenings, if for some reason we don't have a discussion, people are very annoyed. They're like, we didn't come all this way just to watch the film. We came to have a discussion. So that's what I mean, that you have to be a bit alert at what is valuable about a certain practice. How do we reimagine it in a new time? I sometimes feel I don't know the answers, but I turn to my younger colleagues, to say, listen, I have a feeling this is running into some trouble now, this form of sharing films. What do you think we can do? How can we build around films, People will watch the films, whether they watch it on YouTube or whatever they watch it, they'll watch it. But how do we maximize what our intention was, that people talk about it, share it, and so on? So I think in the main, I think a flexible, non-hierarchical attitude is, I think, the only thing that will keep afloat what we are trying to do.